We're diving into an intense interview moment where Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi faces off with a tough confrontational host, and what happens next is a masterclass in staying calm under pressure. Pam Bondi stepped into the sleek glass building that housed The Deep Dive, a wildly popular political podcast known for its sharp interviews and headline-making moments. As she was led down a narrow hallway lined with screens showing past episodes, she could feel the energy buzzing through the walls, a mixture of anticipation and in front of crowds more times than she could count. But today felt different. Something about this setup, the hushed voices of the crew, the way the production assistants avoided her gaze, made her stomach tighten, though she didn't let it show. The studio itself was small but high-tech, with soft glowing lights framing two sleek chairs and a low black table where two microphones waited. Across from where she would sit was a giant screen displaying the Deep Dive logo pulsing faintly in blue and white. Pam adjusted her blazer, her eyes quickly scanning the space, reading every detail the way a seasoned attorney sizes up a courtroom before trial. She knew Miles Carter, the host, had a reputation for being ruthless, a man who lured guests in under the guise of a friendly chat only to ambush them with loaded questions. Officially, the invite had been to talk about her time as Attorney General and her views on law and leadership, but Pam wasn't naive. She knew this was likely a setup, a chance for Miles to score viral clips at her expense. Still, as she took her seat and waited for the show to start, her face was calm, her posture straight. If Miles wanted a fight, she thought, he'd have to work for it, because she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of watching her flinch. As the cameras blinked to life and the show's theme music faded out, Pam Bondi sat poised, facing Miles Carter across the narrow studio table. The host leaned forward with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, a signature look for Miles, one that viewers had come to recognize as the calm before the storm. "Pam, welcome to The Deep Dive. Glad you could join us," he said smoothly, but there was an edge beneath his tone. Pam gave a polite nod, replying evenly, "Thanks for having me, Miles. Happy to be here." The pleasantries barely out of the way, Miles wasted no time cutting to the heart of his agenda. "Let's not dance around it," he said, steepling his fingers as he looked directly at her. "You've been one of the most controversial figures in state politics. Many would argue that your policies as Attorney General hurt more people than they helped. Some say you protected the powerful while ignoring the cries of everyday citizens. Do you think that's fair? Or are all these people just wrong about you?" The question, sharp as a blade, hung in the air. No easing into her career accomplishments, no thoughtful discussion, straight to the accusations. Pam's face remained composed, though she could sense the tension in the room, even behind the cameras. She recognized this tactic, hit hard, early, and force the guest onto the defensive. But she wasn't about to play that game. She calmly folded her hands on the table. "I think it's a dangerous thing to reduce years of public service into a headline or a soundbite, Miles," she said, her voice level. "But if you want to talk about specific decisions or cases, I'm happy to answer." Miles smirked, leaning back slightly, his eyes glinting. "Oh, we'll get to specifics," he promised, glancing briefly at the camera as if sharing a private joke with the audience. Pam caught that look. This wasn't about a real conversation. He wanted a performance, and she knew now that every word would be a test. Still, she stayed steady, knowing that how she handled these opening shots would define the entire encounter. Miles leaned forward again, this time with a thin stack of papers in hand, shuffling them just loud enough for the microphones to pick up the sound. It was a performance one Pam recognized immediately, meant to give the impression that he was sitting on a mountain of evidence, ready to pounce. "Let's talk specifics since you brought it up," he said, flipping through the papers. "During your time as Attorney General, there was a lawsuit, a serious one, against Westbridge Financial, a company accused of fraudulent business practices ripping off thousands of Americans. And yet somehow that lawsuit just disappeared, dropped, without explanation. And coincidentally, Westbridge was one of your largest donors. So tell me, Pam, was that justice at work, or something else?" The question hung heavy in the studio, and even though Pam expected something like this, she felt the eyes of the small in-studio crew, and imagined the thousands watching live, waiting to see how she would respond. Pam took a slow breath, refusing to let her expression shift. "Miles," she began carefully, her voice calm but firm, "you're implying a connection without offering a single piece of real evidence. That case was reviewed thoroughly, and when the facts didn't hold up in court, it was dropped. As happens in any system governed by due process, not public opinion." Miles let out a quiet, almost amused scoff, leaning back in his chair. "That's a convenient explanation," he said, tilting his head as though examining her. "But a lot of people think otherwise. A lot of people think that if they were in your donor's shoes, they wouldn't have been so lucky." Pam could feel the shift. He was playing to the audience now, turning the conversation into a morality play where she was cast as the villain. Still, she didn't let him see her frustration. "I understand why people might feel that way," she said, her voice steady, "but my responsibility was to follow the law, not feelings, not media narratives. If I had pursued a case without merit, simply to satisfy public outrage, I would have been abusing my office, and I wasn't willing to do that." Miles smiled tightly. "So you're saying it was all above board?" he pressed. Pam's eyes didn't waver. "I'm saying I stand by my decisions. Every one of them was made based on evidence, not pressure, and if you have proof to the contrary, I'd love to see it." The audience was quiet now, watching, listening. Miles tapped his pen against his notes, a subtle sign of irritation. "We'll get there," he muttered. But Pam could see the slight crack in his facade. She had refused to flinch, and now, for the first time, the balance of power in the room was starting to shift, even if only slightly. Pam sat perfectly still as Miles rifled through his notes, clearly hoping to land the next blow, but in that moment she knew it was time to flip the script. Calmly, she leaned forward, folding her hands on the table, and locked eyes with him, a sharp, unwavering gaze that made him pause. "Miles," she said, her tone sharper but still measured, "I've noticed something about the way you're handling this interview." Miles blinked, briefly thrown off by her unexpected pivot. You're asking a lot of questions about me, my decisions, my career, and that's fine. I agreed to come here knowing you would challenge me, but what you're really doing is lobbing accusations without facts. You're creating a narrative designed to get a reaction, not a real conversation." Miles recovered quickly, but the crack had already appeared. "Pam, I'm just asking what the public wants to know," he said smoothly, flashing a smile toward the camera. "People deserve answers." Pam smiled faintly, but her eyes were sharp. "Do they?" she said, letting the question hang in the air for a beat. "Because what I see here isn't a search for answers. It's a search for headlines, something you can clip, share online, and spin into a viral moment. And that's fine if that's what this show is about, but if we're going to sit here and pretend this is about justice and truth, then let's have a real conversation. Let's talk about facts, not just insinuations." The room grew noticeably quieter. Even the crew members behind the cameras seemed to be watching more intently now. Miles leaned in, trying to regain his footing. "All right, Pam. You want to talk facts? Let's talk about how—" "But," Pam cut in smoothly, her voice still calm, but carrying more weight now, "actually, Miles, before you go there, let me ask you something." Her interruption stunned him into silence. "You've sat here for 20 minutes painting me as corrupt, as someone who worked the system. So let me ask you, what's your definition of justice? Is justice about accusing people without proof? Is it about ignoring facts because they don't fit your story? Or is it about doing the hard work of actually examining evidence and letting people speak?" Miles opened his mouth but paused. Pam didn't let him finish. "Because if it's the last one, then let's do that. Let's have that conversation. But if this is just about putting on a show, then be honest with your audience about what you're doing." The air in the room shifted. The audience, which had been eating up Miles' accusations earlier, now looked uneasy. A few people in the front row exchanged glances. Some leaned forward, clearly more engaged than before. Miles gave a tight smile, clearly annoyed but trying to mask it. "I think people just want transparency, Pam." Pam nodded, seizing on his words. "So do I. So let's be transparent. Let's talk about why, instead of asking about my actual policies, you're spending all this time trying to make me look like a villain. Let's talk about why we aren't discussing how to fix the system, but instead why you keep focusing on personal attacks." Miles hesitated, flipping through his notes again, but now he looked like he was stalling. "And while we're at it," Pam added, leaning in slightly, her voice quiet but powerful, "why don't you tell me, since you seem to think you know so much about what it's like to make decisions under pressure, what would you have done in my position? How would you handle cases with enormous public pressure on one side and complex evidence on the other?" Miles stared at her, caught off guard, and for a moment, he had no answer. Pam sat back, letting the silence speak volumes. "Exactly," she said, and for the first time the power in the room was hers. Miles shifted in his chair, his polished confidence beginning to crack under the weight of Pam's calm but unrelenting pushback. He flipped through his notes again, now more out of habit than need. A stalling tactic, Pam recognized it immediately. The silence from the audience was louder than any applause. But Miles wasn't about to give up that easily. If challenging her professional record wasn't enough, he'd go for something deeper. He sat up straighter and adjusted his mic, his tone suddenly taking on a more casual, almost condescending edge. "Pam," he said with a thin smile, "you talk a lot about leadership and responsibility, but let's get real for a second. A lot of people see someone like you, someone who's had power, influence, and protection, and wonder if you've ever really faced the consequences of your decisions. I mean, wasn't there a time when the public tried to hold you accountable, and instead of engaging with them you just walked away?" Pam felt the shift immediately. She knew exactly where he was going before he even said it. Miles leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "I'm talking about that night outside the Tampa Civic Center. The protests, the crowd waiting for you. People shouting, demanding answers, and you just ignored them. Some would say you were too afraid to face them." A low murmur rippled through the audience, some leaning in, curious to see if this would be the moment Pam broke. But she didn't. She took a breath, her posture unchanging, her gaze steady. "Miles," she said evenly, "what you're referring to is a night when I was harassed, followed, and physically assaulted walking into a public event. Protest is a right. Intimidation and violence are not." Miles smirked, trying to play off her answer. "But don't you think if people are that angry, if they feel like the system failed them, that maybe you owed them a response?" Pam leaned in slightly, her voice sharpening just enough to slice through the tension. "Are you suggesting that because people are angry, I should subject myself to being spit on, yelled at, threatened? Would you say the same if it was a journalist, a colleague, maybe even you? In my place—" The room went still. Even Miles blinked, caught for a second in the weight of her words. Pam didn't let up. "Because if you're going to argue that mob intimidation is justified, I want to hear you say that clearly, right here, on the record." Miles faltered, a flicker of uncertainty flashing across his face before he forced a smirk back into place. "I'm just saying people were desperate." Pam didn't miss a beat. "Desperation doesn't excuse violence, Miles, and I won't stand here and let you suggest otherwise." The audience shifted. For the first time it was clear Pam was fully in control, and Miles was scrambling. For a long, heavy moment, the studio sat in silence, the kind of silence that felt louder than words. Miles Carter, usually quick with a snappy comeback, sat frozen for just a beat too long, realizing that his attempt to rattle Pam had backfired spectacularly. Pam sat across from him, composed, unwavering, her hands neatly folded on the table, but now there was a quiet confidence radiating from her. She knew she had turned the tide. Slowly she leaned in, breaking the silence with a calm, direct tone. "Miles, let me ask you something," she said, her voice cool but carrying undeniable authority. "You've spent most of this interview making accusations, insinuating corruption, twisting stories, but you haven't asked a single question about the real issues people care about. So tell me, what exactly are we here to talk about? Are we discussing justice? Or is this just a show for clicks and views?" The question hit harder than any accusation Miles had thrown her way. He blinked, caught off guard, and tried to recover, sitting up straighter. "Pam, I think people want to know who they can trust," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier sharpness. Pam tilted her head slightly, her gaze fixed on him. "Great," she replied smoothly. "Let's talk about trust. Let's talk about the real problems people face. The failures in the system, the broken policies that leave people behind. But we can't do that if we're too busy chasing sensational headlines, can we?" The audience was locked in now, watching not just an interview but a power shift. Pam was no longer the guest being grilled, she was the one steering the conversation. Miles forced a chuckle, trying to regain control. "So what are you saying, Pam, that this is all my fault?" Pam didn't even blink. "I'm saying that if we're serious about justice, then we need to have serious conversations. And right now, instead of talking about solutions, you're trying to make me your headline. But let's be real, Miles. The people watching at home don't care about your gotcha questions. They care about what's being done to fix the system." A soft ripple of murmurs moved through the audience. Nods of agreement, subtle but noticeable. Pam saw it, but she didn't gloat. She kept her tone even, focused. "So, here's my question to you, Miles," she continued. "You've asked me plenty. Now I'm asking you, if you think the system is broken, what would you do differently? What's your solution?" Miles opened his mouth, but no words came out right away. He blinked, flipping his notes as though an answer might be hiding between the pages. Pam sat back slightly, watching him with an expression that said everything. "I'm not here to play your game." In that moment, everyone knew Pam Bondi was running the interview now. Miles sat stiffly, his earlier bravado now visibly worn thin. He glanced down at his notes once more, but whatever strategy he had entered the studio with was now in pieces. Sensing his hesitation, Pam leaned in slightly, her gaze steady, her voice calm but filled with quiet authority. "Look, Miles," she said, her tone softer but still firm, "I didn't come here to spar. I came here because I believe conversations like this should matter. But if we're going to spend all our time twisting words and throwing out baseless accusations, then we're not serving anyone, least of all the people watching." Miles forced a tight smile, clearly trying to recover some control as he glanced at the camera. "Well, Pam, I think you've certainly made your point today," he said, attempting to close the conversation on his terms. Pam returned his look with a small, polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I always aim to, Miles," she replied smoothly. "And maybe next time we can have a real conversation, one that focuses on facts and solutions, not just spectacle." A ripple of soft applause moved through the studio, small but meaningful, as a few audience members nodded in agreement. For the first time all night, Pam had the last word, and everyone knew it. Miles shifted uncomfortably in his seat, adjusting his papers, as though by moving them he could shift the narrative back into his control. But it was too late. The cameras stayed on a moment longer before the producer called, "And..." cut. The red light blinked off, but the impression Pam left would remain long after the cameras stopped rolling. As Pam stepped out of the studio into the cool night air, she exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the interview still lingering on her shoulders. But as she pulled out her phone, any lingering tension was immediately replaced with a rush of adrenaline. Her screen lit up with a flood of notifications, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all buzzing relentlessly. The interview had only wrapped minutes ago, but already clips were everywhere, circulating faster than she could scroll. Hashtags like Pam Bondi Unfiltered and Miles Shutdown were trending. Pam tapped into a few posts, reading snippets that brought a small, knowing smile to her lips. Say what you will about Pam Bondi, but that is how you handle a hostile interview. Masterclass in staying calm under pressure. Miles tried to ambush her and she turned it right back on him. Brutal. Finally, someone calls out these gotcha interviews for what they are: respect. Some comments were more critical, questioning her record or accusing her of being evasive, but the overwhelming tone was clear. People had watched a battle of wills, and Pam had walked away as the winner. Even news outlets were picking it up, with headlines like, Pam Bondi turns the tables in heated interview, and talk show host stumbles as guest takes control. Pam scrolled further, watching short video clips of key moments. Her sharp questions back at Miles, his visible hesitation, her refusal to be baited. Commenters dissected every word, every look, every pause. Some people even started sharing reaction videos, praising how she stayed composed when most would have snapped. Yet for Pam, it wasn't about scoring points. It was a reminder of why staying steady in the storm mattered, why not every fight had to be loud to be effective. As she slipped her phone into her pocket and walked toward her car, she thought about how quickly narratives could be shaped, and how, sometimes, the truth breaks through the noise when you least expect it. Tonight, she hadn't just survived, she had taken control of the narrative, and she knew everyone had seen it happen. The story of Pam Bondi's interview teaches a powerful lesson about the importance of staying calm and composed under pressure. In a world where public figures are often ambushed with accusations and forced into defensive corners, Pam shows that real strength lies in controlling the narrative, not reacting emotionally. Instead of falling for the host's provocations, she listens carefully, responds with facts, and challenges the host to reflect on his own tactics. This approach not only protects her credibility but also shifts the power dynamic, proving that staying grounded can diffuse even the most aggressive attacks. Another key lesson is about the value of speaking directly to the audience rather than getting lost in a battle of egos. Pam's focus on real issues and her refusal to engage in petty drama resonates with viewers, reminding us that authenticity and clarity win over spectacle. Finally, the story highlights how public discourse today is often shaped by viral moments, and that owning your truth calmly and confidently is the most effective way to stand out in the noise. In high-pressure situations, composure, integrity, and control of your message are your greatest assets.